So this is the portion of the program where it gives you an opportunity to ask questions from the floor. There's two microphones that are stationed in kind of the middle. If you've got a question that you'd like to share with the audience, please feel free. Before I forget, if you're like me and feel a need to be connected to the internet, if you jump online, you can find UW-Net available here in the ballroom. You create your own guest user access and you're good to go. So just thought I'd share that because it made me crazy not to be able to find something. Sarah, how you doing, kid? What do you got for our guest today?
Hi, thank you very much. Sarah Lloyd, I work on the Grassland 2.0 project at the UW. Going back to the discussion of GDP, gross domestic product, I'm just wondering, there's a lot of alternative measures like happiness indexes and social development or sustainable development indices. And I'm wondering if you or someone at Wisconsin is layering in some of those other ways of measuring what the actual social and economic outputs are of these systems.
The afternoon session is exactly designed to address that question. One of the things that economists tend to focus on things we can measure: jobs, income, businesses, GDP. We can measure it with a fair amount of accuracy. When we start to get into things like quality of life and livability, it becomes squishy. But there's an initiative, the Rural Livability Project, that's being funded by a grant out of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, that is trying to actually put some meat on that. And Amanda Weinstein from the Rural Institute, thank you, is going to be talking about some approaches that we can do that. So great setup. Yeah. Great setup for the afternoon.
Anybody else have? I'm just going to ask big question, but maybe both can chime in. So I'm watching those trends. Noticed O'Connell County didn't make it anywhere near rent values. What about the demographic changes? How many of these landowners are retirement age and don't want to stick their neck out on another operating loan at what I know is going to be a loss? I've got some equity built up. I've got a little bit of savings. I'm curious what we're thinking. Are they going to flatline it? Not to take off Sarah, but are they going to plant it to grass, roll it to pasture, oats, something that's less risk? And if that's the case, and then the other one, Paul, is ARC PLC. You teased me with that before we started. So demographics, if you want, as far as none of us necessarily getting any younger, but still baby boomers holding the largest cash hold in the United States, go for it.
Yeah, that's the one thing. I think the reality is back to like what Steve was saying, what Sarah's alluding to. If you've got your farm paid for or nearly paid for, you don't have to be as responsive to, I got to cover my opportunity costs. I could have rented this out. Once you get to that later stages of life, in your phase of your career, you can start looking at broader things. And you see that. Iowa State University did a big survey, and you see a lot more interest in conservation programs and stuff like that. It's in those, when you're trying to make a living and you've got young family you're supporting, you got kids you want to send to UW-Madison to go to college, you got to cover that tuition dollars so Steve and I can get our salaries and stuff like that. It's expensive. And then as you move into later, and so it kind of is part of that career. And we're seeing a lot of farmers moving into, and the land ownership has always been at the older level. And that the hard part is, so they're more interested in other things than just making a straight, got to make money, got to cover those opportunity costs for land, got to cover those opportunity costs for my time and energy. You start looking at broader things like rural livability and conservation programs and such. But the other thing then is the difficulty is getting the next generation into farming. That's the hard part. If you're 30 years old and trying to get into this, you got high interest rates, you got high land values. Oh my gosh, how am I going to start as farming? That's where these farm transition programs are so important, is finding out ways. And that's who really bears the cost of these high interest rates, high land values, and high rental rates, is the younger generation trying to get in. And I think what you're seeing is some of these older generations are trying to find ways to get the next generation into farming. And they don't always have to get fair market values necessarily, particularly for relatives. But it is a definite burden, is trying to get in when those interest rates are high. We'll talk about ARC and PLC briefly, but I took a slide out on the farm bill. Basically, I don't know what's going to happen in the farm bill. Jeepers cats. It's who knows if we're going to get a farm bill, another extension. There does seem to be some stomach for raising the price floors and maybe having an escalator like it's actually kicking in. But this year, right now, these prices we're projecting, I think in ARC is the better policy to sign up for, the better program to sign up for your base acres for all across all the crops. There's a new price forecast coming out from the USDA in mid-February. Maybe I'll update myself. But right now, if you got to make up your sign-up elections, I have it on my webpage. Go with the county ARC program. You got some questions?
I think the one thing I'll add to that is one of the things, I'm from Illinois, where farming is corn and beans.
Yeah.
Beans and corn, period. That's it. Wisconsin agriculture is extremely diversified in terms of the crops, in terms of the commodities, in terms of the products, also in terms of the size of the operations. We're seeing a growth in the number of small farms. So when we talk about these things, it's really kind of hard to make broad generalizations because Wisconsin farming is so diversified.
Mm-hmm.
So these guys have a real challenge because they're trying to give advice, and what may make sense for a big corn and soybean farmer may not make sense for a smaller scale operator. So my hat's off to them trying to,
Doug?
Yeah, this is a related question. I do a lot of work in the dairy industry, and the size of dairy farms tends to double. There's a doubling effect, sort of with each generation, or even less. So now we're seeing farms with 3,000 cows doubling to 6,000 cows, which is, so my question is the rate of change in the size of operation, the consolidation of, both in dairy, but also in the cropping fields, is that rate of change increasing?
nationally, no, it's slowing down. The most of the consolidation occurred after the farm crisis in the early 1980s. So there's tremendous consolidation, tremendous growth, but this is a national perspective. It really started to slow down towards the end of the 1980s. So what we're seeing here is kind of happening at the tails of the distribution. So what we're seeing is growth in the very largest farms, a small increase in that end of the tail. We're seeing a bigger increase in smaller farms. But I think in terms of the ability to continue that, it's going to depend on where you're at in the state, because a lot of those farms require local approval. And we know that in some parts of Wisconsin, there's real pushback on those big CAFOs. Other parts of the state welcome with open arms. So it depends on where you're at in the state.
And we also have smaller farms that are multi-site dairies, just to stay under the numbers.
Part of the doubling too is I'm in my late 50s now, and if I had a son and I were a dairy farmer and we're ready to, he or she, maybe it's my daughter, we're ready to move into part of the operation. All of a sudden now I've got two families to support. How am I going to support two families? I got to get bigger. It's not just me anymore. So what do? If you want to have two incomes, you got to have double the cows. I mean, that's kind of the idea. And hopefully, so that's driving part of it as well. I haven't looked at the data this year. A lot of years I do the dairy farm consolidation. I look at farm bankruptcies. I didn't do that this year. But that rate's been pretty steady. But I would defer, maybe ask the same question to Chuck Nicholson when he does the dairy talk. If he's been I don't know if you've been looking at, but I know the average the average cows in the state is over 200 now as of not the summer of 2023, but the summer of 2022. That's a large dairy now, or an average dairy is over 200 cattle. So that used to be considered a large dairy, and it's not anymore.
One more question.
You also have kind of two economic units on the farm. You have the farm enterprise itself. You also have the farm family. And increasingly, those farm families are dependent upon off-farm income. Yeah. So this labor shortage, there's a real opportunity here for a lot of these farms. The farm enterprise can't support two families, but off-farm income can keep the family afloat, which allows the farm to continue operating.
That's how I grew up.
I have a market question related to supply and demand. So I am a cash crop farmer, grain and canning vegetables. What I see is that the market for, particularly on the grain side, is pretty much influenced by the amount of exports that we can And we are badly hurt because of geopolitical issues, particularly with China. And Mexico is unable to compensate for losses in exports to China. So in addition to that, what I see is we can no longer compete with Brazil and Argentina in terms of corn and soybeans. And on the canning vegetable side, we have a demand issue there that there just isn't enough demand, so then on the grain side, what do we replace our grains with? There just isn't the market for these small grains. So how are we who are trying to engage in this market of cash cropping able to survive in the future? And how do you look at that? Thank you.
I'll say a little bit, and then I think when John does his talk on grains, he can talk a little bit about it. John Heinberg. Yeah, that's a real problem. I mean, a few years ago, I think it's 2021 or 22, is when Brazil became the world's largest soybean producer. They surpassed the U.S. We are now number 2 in soybeans, and China is the world's number 2 corn producer. In terms of bushels, just raw number of bushels or metric tons, whatever you want to use. But their yields about a decade ago were half of what ours were. Now they're like 65%. They're gaining on us. And there's going to come, so I think basic reality is we've got a lot of extra grain production in the world. And the rest of the world's catching up to us. We're keeping ahead, but that gap is going to keep shrinking. And so I think the reality is, yeah, we're really good at corn and soybeans, but that's not going to last. The rest of the world's catching up. And that's just what's going to happen. That's like the long run trend. And then the canning crops are a good example. We're really good at doing canned vegetables, but the world doesn't want a lot of canned vegetables. And my understanding is we can't export them very well. It's the metal tariffs are really killing us. And my understanding is the vegetables aren't worth that much in the can. It's the can itself. And so we have a project to look at some of that, kind of come up with some different alternatives. But some of these multinational companies are looking to, instead of exporting exporting the metal and the vegetables in the can, let's put the processing facility somewhere else. Well, some companies can't do that. It's a real struggle. What am I going to do? And that the struggle you were facing, Michael, about what do I do for crops? What do I do for canning vegetables? The companies are facing the same issues. They got to think about how do we maintain competitiveness in a global market for grain, but also for our what we're good at, canned processed vegetables. So and there's no easy answers. Competition is tough. That's always the way it is. Competition is it's a two-edged sword in that sense. It cuts both ways. And so you got to be careful. If you're really good at it, you attract attention, and other people start getting really good at it too. So,
Very good questions. Good kickoff to this Ag Outlook Forum. Let's thank Steve and Paul again for sharing their insights and guidance.